Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Tiki Goth Club. I am Ray, and this is my co-host, Jamie.
Hello.
And today we're going to talk about Jamie's favorite band. And who is that band?
That band is the Cramps.
Yeah. The Cramps, they're a gateway band to a lot of different things.
I would say yes, because they mixed so many things to be who and what they were.
I mean, it's like punk, rockabilly, goth, surf. And if you kind of laid this all out, you'd be like, well, none of this makes sense, but it completely does make sense.
Totally makes sense.
So, how did you get into the Cramps?
I went to a show when I was about 15 or 16 years old.
Yep.
Based on a boy I thought was cute. Had a t-shirt, the Bad Music for Bad People t-shirt. And I figured since, cute boy had that shirt, that band must be cool. So I went. I was expecting something like kind of hardcore punk.
Yeah.
And I stood in the back, like up on these chairs, and watched the most outrageous thing I'd ever seen in my life. Since I had no preconceived notion, I had not heard one single note.
You didn't even hear them.
I'd never even heard a song. Didn't know anything.
You're literally you're basing this all off of a cute boy wearing a t-shirt.
Yes. Which is what you do when you're 15, 16 years old. But I was into punk at the time. I was already baby punk. And
yeah, but the interesting thing about the Cramps, though, is they're not like punk how you think, though.
No, they are not, which I learned that day. But I saw the most outrageous stage show I'd ever seen in all my life, and saw, all these people, and realized that was sort of my my first realization that, like, I had people. That I wasn't just the one lonely weirdo at my little podunk school, that there were other people that were into, like, crazy music, and because just lyrically there's stuff, there's cars and horror movies and crazy outfits, and that's when I kind of realized, a lot of sex, drugs, and rock and roll,
like literally.
I saw Lex's penis that first show.
Did you really?
I did. It was my first penis
was it
visually.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, I was a kid.
How far were you away from
I
Lex's?
was probably like 40 feet away.
Oh, okay,
so
okay.
It was,
so it ain't like you were up front. No, well, there it is.
But you know what? For every other show, I was up front.
For Poison Ivy.
Yes, I camped out at Ivy's feet, basically. She became my idol. I would still consider her an idol.
She was my first rock and roll crush.
Yeah, mine too.
I remember my introduction to the Cramps was a friend of mine had the single for Can Your Pussy Do the Dog. And I remember hearing the title. Okay.
You're like, what?
I'm like, all right, okay. And it didn't have to sell me anymore, but
you're like, what's the dog?
He puts on the record, the needle to the record. Here, kitty, kitty. I'm like, yeah, I'm in.
Move along.
I'm in. And then my first album I got from the Cramps was A Date with Elvis, which is my favorite album from the Cramps still. And just like the song titles, like The Hot Pearl Snatch, What's Inside a Girl, Corn-Fed Dames, Aloha from Hell, and I was a fan from there on in. And I remember when I got into Tiki, it wasn't so far removed from the world that the Cramps built for me.
Yes.
Because they have a world. There's this world of the Cramps that they created.
Yeah, there's definitely a unique aesthetic in the way that they blended music and their wardrobes and their house. If you've ever seen pictures of their house.
They got a large record collection.
They do.
Well, let's talk about their wardrobe. I'll be honest with you, that's the first time I ever saw anyone wearing latex. Ever. And it brings me to the question that I want to ask you. 2 questions.
Okay.
Are the Cramps goth?
I would give that a no.
Okay.
But they have visual goth elements.
Okay.
I would say that musically, This is where everything starts to interweave and overlap.
Let's do it. Let's go down that road.
So musically, I would say that the overlap with goth has a lot to do with some of the darker imagery in a lot of their music, and a lot of that darker imagery comes not from like the depression, sadness of like a lot of goth music, but from like B movies and horror movies and monster movies, and so you have a lot of those like the dark themes in their music, and then they would in videos that would come out as well, like in Creature from the Black Leather Lagoon.
Yeah. No, the movie of the song.
Right? But that's where you get some of that where it's like, no, they're not goth, but there's these elements that overlap and intertwine.
So like when you go back to the 80s and into the 90s, I remember a lot of shows weren't just, oh, this is going to be a goth show or this is going to be a punk rock show. You talk about the Cramps. The bands that opened up for the Cramps were definitely wide and varied. Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I don't really know of too many other bands that sound like the Cramps.
Unfortunately, not. I wish there were more.
It's the same, like we're talking about, like they're a very, very big influence in, was it psychobilly bands? Mm-hmm. But they don't sound nothing like psychobilly to me.
Not psychobilly as it is now. But I think also what we have right now is we have the power of retrospect. So at the time...
What?
Retrospect.
What's that?
So like we have today's eyes that we can look backward to that time in the 80s and 90s, and we can piece these together as something cohesive. Whereas at the time, these things were just sort of unfolding and happening, and there weren't names for things yet. Now, we can look back and we can lump all these things together because they already happened. It's history, so we can combine them in these tidy little, like these bands are this and those bands are that.
Yeah.
But at the time, we didn't really have that. It was just a lot of, in a lot of, like the punk bands and stuff, it would just be like 5 bands are playing tonight and they would just all come on and do their thing because that's who was available, know?
So you may be asking yourself, how can I join the Tiki Goth Club? Well, there is no membership. There are no fees. But I have shirts for sale. They're $20 a piece, $5 shipping and handling. If you're interested, go to my website, tikiwithray.com. There's a prompt that says buy a shirt. Follow that, and then that's how you can get your own. When I'm thinking about Tiki, and I'm thinking about the Cramps, and you named it, world building. Mm-hmm. It's all about the world building. And just like you said with the Cramps, it's like you have all these different things that they're talking about that creates this world of the Cramps. And if you're into the Cramps, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, you know that what that aesthetic looks like.
But there's bands that I like where there is no world building. It's just they're a band and they play music.
Yeah. And they go home in their regular looking house and they wear their pretty much regular looking clothes, and
they might have a look, but there's no.
And they can sound awesome. So I'm not discounting like the actual musicianship in bands that don't have like a whole world.
There's one band, a more recent band that's as far as I'm concerned, they're carrying the torch for the Cramps, and that's Master Chups.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could see how. Well, and I would say that they were heavily influenced.
Oh yeah,
they were like, let's make a band. We don't want to be a Cramps cover band, but let's use all of this influence, all the all the spirit that we get from them.
Yeah, they're from Russia, so that they already have this like Russian thing to them. But like, what it's funny because they're an industrial. They're not industrial. An instrumental band where there's no lyrics, but it's all about the song titles, and they make a lot of videos that you can watch on YouTube, and it's like full on again.
They're like mini movies.
Yeah, B movies, horror. There's actually some tiki elements going on, and they're doing the world building thing. But the Cramps did it the best, and they did it first. Mm-hmm. So, would you say that the Cramps are more of an influence, or maybe like an outlier to the goth scene than them just being goth themselves?
Yeah, it's interesting because back in like the early 90s when I discovered the Cramps, was also the time that I was most into goth. And so I was like going to, our one and only goth club at the time.
Yep.
At school I was like that girl, and even though their sound wasn't gothy at all, and their look could actually be considered very goth-like.
Oh, yeah.
And that's kind of where, like some of that overlap happens. I think the first time I saw them was Lux was wearing like black vinyl pants
Yep.
and a black vinyl shirt, which eventually came off. But he had the
Yep.
black hair and like the black patent heels.
Yep.
And
he wore some kind of a makeup that made him look very, very pale.
yeah, he had that like the pallor, and I think
Unless he was that pale.
I think he's probably pretty pale, but I think that he did wear like
Yeah.
more pale makeup. But then Ivy would also sometimes wear things that had sort of these gothy elements with a lot of black and like black sequins and or like spider web looking things. And so I think just visually it went, and so it made sense, this connection between the goth, aesthetic.
Yeah.
Like I said, I would say that they overlap with goth more aesthetically than musically. Because when I think of goth music, I think of things that are very slow and sad sounding, and neither of those words could be described for the Cramps.
I think it could potentially be because as we're talking, I'm thinking as a punk rocker, around the early 80s, that's when the Damned were starting to do went into that goth phase. Mm-hmm. I remember the Lords of the New Church they started, and they that's off of the heels of the Dead Boys and the Damned for that matter. And it's like this music that it's punk, I guess, but you could see all three of these bands playing together when it all makes sense. Yeah, it'd be funny. It's like, hey, like it's the hey, we're gonna go see the Damned, the Lords of the New Church, and the Cramps.
That would be an amazing show.
Oh, you're going to a goth show, and you'd be like, yeah, all right, or you could say you're going to a punk show.
Although back then, like, calling things goth, that's even newer, because back then it was called death rock.
Death rock.
Which to me, like when I hear the term death rock, I think it sounds, in my brain, sounds like death metal. Like I would think like, but what we now call goth back then was in many places referred to as death rock. So you would have gone to a death rock show, I think.
So what was the term that you said a couple minutes ago? Retro, what is it?
Oh, retrospect.
Retrospect. I think that's what we're seeing a lot of. Retrospect.
Because you can
look back
things
now
together and see how they make sense, where
Yeah.
at the time it was just, that's who was there.
Yeah. The 80s and the 90s were a very, very interesting time. I'm glad that we can have the retrospect to look back at it now and be like, okay, yeah. So obviously this is the Tiki Goth Club. This is me and Jamie. But Jamie also has a Facebook group.
Yeah.
Page.
So we started the Goth Tiki Facebook group, as well as Goth Tiki on Instagram. And I started it not knowing if other people were going to be into these things together, and it really, people are really digging it. There's a lot of people who are into mixing the goth and the tiki together, and I love that you are starting, we're doing this new series on your show to talk about it, and because I love the creativity that comes out of that I've seen in all of this. It's really awesome.
Yeah, and the Facebook group page is Jamie's baby. That's your thing more so than me, but the Tiki Goth Club, this is us.
Yep.
And but we're all trying to do the same thing, which is to bring the worlds of goth and tiki together. So what do you do? You making a drink over there?
Like, are you gonna be noisy?
You guys go right ahead.
I'll just be shaking drinks over here.
All right, you guys go. You're completely fine.
Quiet on set.
All of a sudden, Sven becomes that guy. No, he's going to be the guy. He's going to sit over there. All of a sudden, there's always the person that's like, Oh no, I don't want to be on camera. And then they end up talking half the time, sitting over there. That's not true at all. That's not what happened. I remember I was going. I said, what? You want to come on the camera? Oh, no.